There's a moment in Attack on Titan where a boy watches his mother get eaten alive, and you think you understand what that moment does to him. You think it's about grief or rage or the desire for revenge. You're wrong. That moment doesn't break Eren Yeager. It finishes something that was already happening inside, something that had been building since the day he was born behind walls he never consented to. By the end of this story, Eren will kill 80% of the human population on Earth, and a significant portion of the people watching, millions of fans across the world, will have felt at some point that he was right. Not because they're violent people, because the story built them that way, slowly, quietly, over hundreds of hours. Attack on Titan is not a story about a boy who becomes a monster. It's a story about how you can be led to justify almost anything if the fear is real enough and the cause feels personal enough. This documentary is about four things: the psychology of living inside walls, the transformation of Eren Yeager from child to catastrophe, the ideology clash between Eren and his brother Zeke, and the uncomfortable question of why millions of people supported a fictional genocide. We're going to follow all of it. We're going to get uncomfortable. And by the end, I think you'll understand something about yourself that you didn't come here to learn. The walls were never meant to protect you. Wall Maria, Wall Rose, Wall Cena, three concentric circles of stone, each one 100 meters tall. Inside them, all that remains of humanity. At least that's what the people inside believe. For 100 years, they lived there, born there, died there, told their children that this was the world, and that outside the walls was nothing but death. And here's the first disturbing thing about Attack on Titan. That setup, that is not a fantasy. In the 1960s, psychologist Martin Seligman ran a series of experiments now known as the Learned Helplessness Study. Dogs were placed in environments where they received electric shock they couldn't escape. Then the environment changed, an exit appeared. But the dogs didn't move. They'd already learned that trying was useless. They lay down and accepted the pain. The people inside the walls had been living in that cage for 100 years. Not for one generation, for 5. The memory of the outside world had been erased. The knowledge that the walls were a choice, a political choice made by a king, had been deliberately hidden. So when the Titans broke through, it wasn't just a physical attack, it was a psychological collapse. For the first time, people were confronted with the reality that the safety they'd built their entire identity around was always fragile, always conditional, always, on some level, a lie. The walls didn't just protect people from Titans, they protected people from the truth about themselves, that they were prisoners who had learned to love their prison. Psychologists studying totalitarian regimes, societies that have survived under authoritarian control, consistently find the same pattern. When the system collapses or is exposed, people don't respond with immediate relief. They respond with terror, because the prison gave them meaning. It gave them structure. It told them who the enemy was and what mattered and why they were alive. And when you take that away, even if it was oppressive, what's left feels like nothing. Eren Yeager was the rare exception. Child who looked at the wall and felt not safety but suffocation, not home but a cage. And that perception, that one refusal to normalize the abnormal, is what sets the entire tragedy in motion. Developed by Greenberg, Solomon, and Pishchinsky in the 1980s, terror management theory proposes that a significant portion of human behavior is driven by our awareness of death and our desperate need to suppress it. When that awareness is activated, when mortality becomes real, people cling harder to their in-groups, their ideologies, their cultural identities. They become more hostile to outsiders, more tribal, more extreme. The breach of Wall Maria wasn't just a disaster, it was a terror management event on a civilizational scale. Suddenly, mortality was everywhere, and the walls, which had suppressed that terror for a century, were no longer enough. So people didn't open up. They closed further. They turned inward. They looked for enemies to blame, heroes to follow, and certainty to hold on to in a world that had just proven it could end. You think you'd respond differently. History suggests otherwise. Every generation has faced its version of a wall breaking down, and almost every generation has responded by building a smaller, more fortified. The making of Eren Yeager. Eren isn't written as a monster who was always going to be a monster. That's not what makes him disturbing. He's written as someone we recognize, passionate, idealistic, the kind of kid who sees injustice and can't stay quiet about it, the kind of kid who reads about the world outside the walls and can't sleep because of how badly he wants to see it. He's written to be you before everything happened, and then his mother is eaten, not killed, eaten in front of him while he is too small to save her, while a soldier has to carry him away screaming while he watches her face disappear into something monstrous and indifferent. Now, here's something that trauma research consistently tells us and that Attack on Titan embeds into its entire structure. In his landmark work, The Body Keeps the Score, psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk describes how childhood trauma, particularly incidents involving helplessness and witnessing violence, doesn't simply become a memory. It becomes a template, a lens through which every subsequent threat is filtered. Survivors of early traumatic helplessness often develop a compulsive need to achieve control, to ensure they are never helpless again, no matter the cost. Erin's entire arc, from the first episode to the last, is a story about a child who was made helpless at the worst possible moment and who spent the rest of his life systematically eliminating every situation where helplessness was possible. When he can't fight the Titans, he trains obsessively. When he can't fight the system, he infiltrates it. When he can't fight the world, he decides to eliminate the world first. Every escalation in Erin's behavior follows this logic perfectly. Erin doesn't become radical because he stopped caring about people. He becomes radical because he cared so intensely, and the world kept proving that caring wasn't enough to protect them. There's a study in social psychology about something called moral disengagement, described by Albert Bandura in the 1990s. It's the process by which people who hold genuine moral values gradually detach those values from specific action, usually actions they need to perform or feel they must perform. You don't abandon your morality, you quarantine it. You tell yourself the people on the other side aren't really people, or that this specific act is an exception, or that someone has to do this terrible thing, and if it's going to happen anyway, it might as well be you. You watch Erin go through every stage of this process in real time. First, he fights the Titans, clear enemies, no moral complication. Then he fights humans who collaborate with Titans, harder but justified. Then he watches the world prepare to annihilate his people, and he starts seeing the world beyond the walls, not as billions of individual lives, but as a threat, an abstract collective threat that can only be neutralized at scale. At some point, Erin stopped seeing people across the sea as people at all. He saw them as a problem, inherited, structural, and incompatible with the survival of everyone he loved. Psychologists call this dehumanization. It's one of the most well-documented precursors to mass violence in human history. The terrifying thing about Erin isn't that he became a monster. It's that the story spent 3 full seasons teaching you to think exactly the way he does, and you didn't notice until it was too late. By the time the rumbling starts, Erin is no longer reacting. He's executing, calm, purposeful, with the expression of someone who has already grieved everything and has nothing left to protect except the out. That's not the face of someone who lost. That's the face of someone who decided. And that distinction between losing control and choosing catastrophe is what separates Erin from every other broken fictional character. He doesn't snap, he commits. 2 brothers, 2 broken answers to the same wound. Zeke Yeager is one of the most unsettling characters in modern fiction. Not because he's cruel, he isn't really. Not because he's calculating, though he absolutely is, but because his ideology makes a horrible kind of sense. And the more you understand where it comes from, the harder it becomes to simply dismiss. Zeke was born to a father who used him as a tool. Grisha Yeager was a man with a cause. Eldian restoration, freedom from Marleyan oppression, and he raised his firstborn son as an instrument of that cause. Every lesson, every story, every moment of fatherly attention was in service of the mission. Zeke was not loved, he was recruited. John Bowlby's foundational research on attachment showed that children deprived of secure, consistent emotional bonding with caregivers develop what are called insecure attachment styles, either anxious, avoidant, or disorganized. Children raised by parents who treat them instrumentally as means to ends rather than as beings of inherent worth often develop deep-seated beliefs that they have no intrinsic value, that they must perform, serve, or sacrifice to earn love. This belief, left unresolved, can calcify into nihilism. Zeke found a surrogate father in Tom Saver, a gentle, broken man who held a secret conviction that being born Eldian was a tragedy, that it would have been better if the Eldian race had never existed at all, that the most compassionate thing that could be done for his people was to ensure they died out quietly, without suffering, without being hunted. Saver's ideology didn't reach Zeke through argument, it reached him through warmth, through the first genuine feeling of being seen and valued that Zeke had ever experienced. And when the idea is delivered by the first person who makes you feel safe, it doesn't feel like an ideology. It feels like a revelation. Zeke's euthanasia plan wasn't born from hatred of his people. It was born from a man who had been taught by the very first person who loved him that his people were better off not existing. So you have two brothers, same father, completely different outcome. Erin's answer to the world's hatred of his people is annihilation. Destroy the threat before it destroys you. Rage externalized. A scream made into an earthquake. Zeke's answer is extinction. Surrender to the logic of the oppressor, but on your own terms. Shame internalized. A whisper made into a plan. In philosophy, there is a concept from Sartre's existentialism called bad faith, the act of denying your own freedom and agency by accepting the definitions others impose on you, pretending you have no choice, accepting the role you've been assigned rather than facing the terror of defining yourself. Zeke's entire worldview is the purest expression of bad faith imaginable. He looked at the world's hatred of his people, and instead of refusing the premise, he agreed with it. He accepted that Eldians were a problem and set about solving the problem with euthanasia, as if the oppressor's judgment about his people's right to exist was simply a fact to be managed. Erin, by contrast, is the opposite failure. Bad faith in reverse. He refuses to accept any limitation on freedom, any moral constraint, any definition of himself imposed from outside. In doing so, he doesn't become free. He becomes trapped in the most absolute sense, a slave to his own rebellion, following a path toward a future he saw in visions he couldn't change, doing things he grieved but couldn't stop. Neither brother was free. One chose oblivion dressed as mercy. The other chose catastrophe dressed as liberation. And the only difference between them was which wound ran deeper, shame or rage. Why did you support the rumbling? Let's talk about the audience, because this is where Attack on Titan does something genuinely unprecedented in the history of storytelling. When the rumbling begins, when Erin activates 80 million colossal titans and marches them toward the continents that want to destroy Paradise, the fandom split dramatically, publicly, loudly, and a significant portion of people, a genuinely large, vocal, passionate portion, supported it. Not ironically, not as a dark thought experiment, they supported it. They wanted Erin to win. They wanted the rumbling to succeed. People will tell you this is because those viewers are broken or sociopathic or just contrarian edgelords performing an aesthetic online. And some of them probably are, but that doesn't explain the numbers. And it doesn't explain the emotional sincerity of the people making those arguments. Research by social psychologist Henri Tajfel, and later expanded by Jonathan Haidt, shows that humans have a natural tendency to expand moral consideration to their in-group, the people they identify with, while contracting it for outgroups. This isn't racism or tribalism as an aberration. It's a baseline cognitive feature, and it can be deliberately engineered. Storytellers, propagandists, politicians, they all know it. Make someone identify with a group long enough, intensely enough, and they'll start unconsciously adjusting what that group is permitted to do. Attack on Titan spent 3 full seasons building your identification with Paradise, with Erin, Armin, Mikasa, Hang, Levi, with the Survey Corps, with this besieged, desperate, beautiful group of people fighting to survive against something they didn't understand. By the time the camera crossed the sea and showed you Marley, showed you that the people outside the walls were also human, also frightened, also parents and children and soldiers who didn't choose the war they were born into, it was too late. The emotional architecture was already built. The moral circle had already contracted around Paradise. And then Isayama made one more move. He gave Erin a plan that had internal logic. It wasn't a random act of violence. It was a strategic calculus built on 100 episodes of established fact. The world hates Paradise. The world will never stop. Diplomacy has already failed, and Paradise has no allies and no military future. You can disagree with that conclusion, but you can't pretend the argument is incoherent. The story built it too carefully for that. Stanley Milgram's famous experiments at Yale demonstrated that ordinary people would administer what they believed were lethal electric shocks to strangers simply because a calm authority figure told them to continue. 65% of participants went all the way to the maximum voltage. The key finding wasn't that people are cruel, most of them were visibly distressed. It was that people are extraordinarily susceptible to authority and context. When the frame says this is necessary, most people will comply. When the story says this is necessary, most audiences will feel the same pull. The story had spent years being the authority figure. It had credibility. It had your trust. And when it said this is the only path left, a significant portion of the audience, trained by hundreds of hours of narrative investment, felt the pull to comply. People didn't support the rumbling because they loved violence. They supported it because fear slowly changed what felt acceptable, and they didn't notice it happening because it happened the same way it always happens, gradually with good reasons, one episode at a time. The audience members who supported Erin weren't uniquely susceptible to manipulation. They were, in many ways, doing exactly what healthy psychological organisms do. They took in information, they identified with characters, they applied the moral logic available to them, and they reached a conclusion. The disturbing part isn't that they reached that conclusion. It's that the exact same cognitive process, the same emotional identification, the same in-group bonding, the same gradual normalization, is how real populations have supported real atrocities throughout human history. The Jaegerists inside the story, parody soldiers who supported Erin's coup, who distributed propaganda, who detained dissidents, weren't evil people either. They were frightened people in a frightened society who had found someone who seemed to have answers and the courage to act on them. That's not a fictional character flaw. That's a documented social psychological mechanism with a name: radicalization through collective fear. The only reason you think Erin went too far is because you watched it from a safe distance. If you were born in Paradise, if your friends died at the wall, if your government was a puppet regime of amnesia, if the world outside was already sharpening weapons to use on you, the honest question isn't whether you'd support the rumbling, it's whether you'd have the courage to oppose it. What the story actually says about us. Attack on Titan ends without a moral verdict. That's intentional. Isayama doesn't tell you whether Erin was right. He doesn't clean up the philosophical mess. He shows you the wreckage, the 80% of humanity that no longer exists, the world that survived, the people who stopped Erin and now have to explain to themselves why they did it when the outcome feels, somehow, like it might have been worse. And he leaves. Just leaves you with it. Because the story was never about whether the rumbling was justified. It was about whether justification itself has limit, whether there is a point at which the logic of survival becomes something unrecognizable, something that can no longer call itself humanity even as it fights for humanity's future. The walls in Attack on Titan mean something specific. They are not just a political system or a military structure. They are the psychological infrastructure of a civilization that chose to survive by forgetting, by not knowing, by building protection into ignorance and calling it peace. And what the story argues, quietly across hundreds of chapters, is that this always fails, that the truth always returns, that the things you wall out come back, and when they do, they come back bigger than when they left. Every character in Attack on Titan is in some sense an answer to the same question. What do you do when the world you were born into is already broken? Historia says, survive, and try to be kind with what remains. Armin says, believe in dialogue even when every instinct says it's already over. Levi says, move forward regardless. Zeke says, let it end quietly. Erin says, burn it all down and hope that what grows back is better. None of them are wrong exactly. None of them are right. The real horror of Attack on Titan is not the Titans. It's not the rumbling. It's the realization, quiet, creeping, unavoidable, that this is what happens to people. This is what happens to all of us when we're afraid for long enough, isolated for long enough, and given enough reasons to stop seeing the people on the other side of the wall as people at all. There's a moment near the end where Erin, inside the paths, the cosmic space where Titan consciousness exists, tells Armin the truth, not the strategic truth, the real one. He tells him that he doesn't know if what he did was right. He tells him he didn't want to die. He tells him he loved Mikasa. He tells him he's sorry. And in that moment, the monster disappears. And what's left is just a boy who was 8 years old when the world fell on him and who spent the next decade trying to control something that was always beyond control. That's not a redemption arc. That's something sadder than that. It's a tragedy without a villain. A story about what happens when a person is made to carry too much for too long, and there is no one present who could have caught them before they became something irreversible. Attack on Titan ends with a bird. It lands on Mikasa. It flies away, and you're supposed to decide whether it means something, whether Erin is there somehow, in some form, free at last from the future he could see and couldn't escape. Maybe he is. Maybe it's just a bird. But here's what that final image actually does. It forces you to carry the unresolved weight of everything that happened. It doesn't resolve the morality. It doesn't tell you who was right. It just shows you that the world kept going, that birds still fly, that the cycle didn't end, it just entered a new phase. And the last thing the story tells you, the very last thing, is that somewhere out there, people are already building new walls, because that's what people do. That's always what people do. The only reason you think Erin went too far is because you watched it from a safe distance.